Good afternoon, everyone. Aloha. You can say aloha. Okay, it's good. We get into the good place, you know. Good afternoon, of course. I wanted to acknowledge Dr. Julie Linton from the American Academy of Pediatrics, who unfortunately wanted to join us at this press conference, but she is at this moment testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee on these very issues that bring us here this afternoon. I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. I'm proud to be joined by two of my colleagues, Senators Merkley and Cortez Masto, who are very strong advocates for immigrants in the U.S. Senate. And we also have representatives from two organizations, Kids in Need of Defense, KIND, and the American Immigration Lawyers Association, who are, and you will hear from them, who are doing important work on the ground to serve immigrant communities across the country. Donald Trump launched his campaign for president with an attack on Mexican immigrants. Who can forget the image of him coming down what he calls the golden escalator? As a candidate, Donald Trump sustained this anti-immigrant sentiment to rile up his base. And as president, he's pursued policies from the Muslim ban to zero tolerance, resulting in family separations, and his vanity wall that target immigrants and immigrant communities. His policies and rhetoric have made a number of problems much worse, particularly as we see an increase in the number of women and children who are fleeing terrible violence in Central America to seek asylum in the United States. We should all have a basic expectation that these migrants, and particularly children who may have been separated from their parents, are afforded basic justice, care, and dignity from the time they arrive at the border until their cases are fairly adjudicated. And of course, during this period of time, they are totally within the custody of the U.S. government. And over the past 2 years, we've heard a number of reports about conditions and customs and border protection facilities. And we were all deeply saddened by the deaths last December of Jacqueline Call and Felipe Gomez Alonso in CBP custody. Let me be clear, no one should be dying when they are in our custody and under our care. And of course, particularly not children. After these deaths, CBP acknowledged that changes needed to be made and are now providing medical screenings to children in their care. Too few children, however, have access to the specialized pediatric care they need in these situations. As former AAP President Dr. Colleen Kraft said, quote, "When it comes to the medical care of children, if you're not trained in pediatric care, you don't know what you don't know." End quote. We also need to set a clear standard to ensure that all children in our custody have their basic needs met. And after we've set the standard, we also need to ensure that they have a fair legal proceeding before a judge who will take the time to impartially evaluate the merits of their case and not speed through a proceeding to fit an arbitrary quota requirement. When I visited the Baltimore Immigration Court in September 2016, I saw an example of how a judge could use her discretion to ensure that kids have access to legal representation before giving thoughtful consideration to the merits of a case. If you were an immigration judge in some other state, maybe a place like Texas, you could have the judge just push these cases through without giving the child, some of them as young as 2, 4, 6 years old, the opportunity to get legal representation. I also saw organizations like Kids in Need of Defense make a real impact on the lives of these children by providing free legal services. Their president, Wendy Young, is here today and will be speaking. Wendy? There, okay, Wendy. Wendy Young is here and she'll be speaking with you shortly. Unfortunately, too few migrant children have access to a lawyer. We were all moved by the story our colleague Senator Durbin shared last summer about children as young as 2 and 4 appearing in immigration court during the family separation crisis. Unfortunately, in these instances, they did have volunteer attorneys, but all unaccompanied children should have access to legal representation. They should not have to rely on the kindness of volunteer lawyers or nonprofit organizations. Today, I introduce 3 bills to ensure that children will receive the care and resources they need from the time they enter our custody to the time their cases are heard. The first bill, the Child Trafficking Victims Protection and Welfare Act, ensures that children in CBP custody receive proper care under the guidance of pediatric medical experts and child welfare professionals. The bill also requires CBP to not just conduct medical assessments on children, but to do so, as I said, with pediatric specialists. The second bill, the Fair Day in Court for Kids Act, requires the government to provide legal representation for unaccompanied migrant children during immigration proceedings. Think about it, these children, very young, they don't speak the language and they are supposed to navigate the immigration proceedings? I should think not. The third bill, the Immigration Court Improvement Act, helps insulate immigration judges from political interference. The bill specifically prohibits the imposition of arbitrary production quotas, like the one former Attorney General Jeff Sessions imposed last October to force judges to speed through consideration of asylum claims. These bills are intended to provide meaningful protections for migrant children in our custody. I'd now like to turn to Senator Merkley for his remarks. Senator?
I am delighted to be here with Senator Hirono to support this set of much-needed bills. What we've seen in immigration is a shift from Mexican men seeking jobs in the United States, as the majority of immigrants coming to the border, to families fleeing persecution in Central America. 2 weekends ago, I went down to El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala to understand better those conditions. There is a huge level of violence against women, a huge level of poverty and inequality, a huge level of child malnutrition. The average 9-year-old in Guatemala is 6 inches shorter than the average Guatemalan child growing up in the United States of America. A huge amount of extortion at the street level, and this is a sort of extortion, this is not the sort of extortion that if you don't pay us, we'll break your shop window. This is a sort of extortion, you don't pay us, we kill you. You don't pay us, we rape your daughter. You don't pay us, we murder your family. Thus, these factors are driving families in desperation north. And we have to do everything we can to assist these nations in addressing these challenges and also the deep-seated corruption. But thus we have families coming north, trying to escape persecution, and we have every responsibility to treat them with decency and respect as they arrive and ask for asylum. There is absolutely no reason to treat them as criminals as they await an asylum hearing, but yet that's what the administration has been doing. The basic premise has been, if we make life really miserable, if we inflict a lot of trauma on the parents and on the children, we will deter families from coming. To have a strategy of deterrence based on inflicting harm on children comes from a very dark and evil place in the heart of this administration. I went back down to the border with the Hispanic caucus to explore why the 2 children died, Jacqueline and Felipe. We heard the Border Patrol say, we conducted 10 wellness checks between this hour and this hour. And it sounded like a really rigorous process of checking the medical condition of the children arriving and the adults. And so I said, what is a wellness check? They said a wellness check is we walk by the room where a whole bunch of immigrants are jammed in there, and we say, does anybody have any issues? And all of the experts on immigration say, and no one responds because no one wants to speak up having just arrived in the U.S. and be separated from their family members. They don't want to speak up and be singled out to be put back across the border. And so they're silent. That is not a wellness check. And we should quit using that name. Now, the administration, after pressure applied about this, is starting to do medical checks. We need to have not just the basics, not just checking in on blood pressure and temperature, asking questions about illness, checking when they last ate. We need to have the sort of serious medical attention that Senator Hirono is proposing. And when it comes to the courts, the idea of migrant children having to stand by themselves without appropriate representation, totally not understand the system, that too is outrageous. So we need to change. Senator Hirono has laid out a pretty important set of bills to do so, and I sure appreciate that she has done it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, and Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. I am honored, along with my colleague, to co-sponsor these bills. I cannot stress enough, and I think we all have seen it, whether it's the horrific stories that we hear about the families that are coming here, or we've all been to the border to see. We know that these families, and it's just what Senator Merkley said, they're making the conscious decision that it is not safe in their homes, in their very home countries. They're making a conscious decision to trek thousands of miles across rough terrain where there's security issues. They know they potentially may not be safe, but it is better for them to do that to save the lives of their children and their family members versus staying at home. So they come here, and they're willingly come up to the Border Patrol and say, I'm here. I'm seeking asylum. And what do? We lock them up. And we tear them, the families apart. We take their children away from them. Literally saw that on the border when I went to the border with Texas. And I think any of us, I don't care what state you're from, when it deals with the best interests of children and these families who are seeking persecution, our human value is to help them. That's who we are. And that, quite frankly, is how our laws are set up. That's why we have asylum laws, and Congress has passed those laws. That's why we have immigration courts. That's why we have so many people trying to do the right thing here. And let me just say, I have watched as this administration has unfolded and played out its zero tolerance policy as a deterrent. Well, the deterrent's not working. What it is working is harming these children and their families. When I was at the border, there was a mother who brought her 5-year-old daughter to this country because of threat of violence and sex trafficking and death to her children. And she brought her youngest daughter, 5 years old. They've never, ever been separated until they came to the United States. And Border Patrol literally told her mother, you either give up your daughter or we're forcibly going to take her and put her on that bus. Never been apart before. Now, I don't know about you, but I think we've all, if you have children or you've worked in child welfare or work with children, you know these are lifelong ramifications to these kids. These are traumatic incidences that are going to live with them for the rest of their lives. And I've worked too hard. I've worked too hard, not only as somebody who believes in the future of kids, not only in this country but around the world, but recognize that our child welfare laws are set up for the best interests of our kids. I don't care whether you're from the United States or what country you're from. We should always be looking out for the best interests of our kids and doing no harm. Doing no harm. So that's why I am proud to co-sponsor these bills, and I'm so glad that Senator Hirono is bringing these forward. We do need training. When I was at the border, and I think we all saw this, when we went to those facilities where they were initially detaining the CBP and the kids and families were in cages, they are cages, there was no doctor there was no pediatrician, there was no social worker, there was nobody looking out for the best interests of those families. Why? Because they're not set up to do that. That is not what Border Patrol ever did previously. They weren't prepared, they weren't staffed for that. And now when these kids are being transferred to HHS through ORR, we still have concerns about what's happening, and we should still be questioning and holding them accountable and protecting these kids and their parents. So I support this legislation, all three of them. They're important from not only bringing the necessary training and health care needs to these kids when they're first, and their families when they first come into our custody and control, but also in our immigration courts. Maisie's absolutely right. When I sat in our immigration court in Las Vegas and watched the judge no longer have discretion, who literally had said before, well, normally I could actually hold off on this deportation right now so we can make sure this child and their family have access to an attorney, or let's look out and see if maybe they can seek relief through our asylum laws or some form of relief that we legally can give them. Judge no longer could do that. They were forced to, under the previous Attorney General, move these cases along, deport, close, move them as fast as they could. We have to stop that. We have to bring common sense back and compassion back to this issue. We can still, believe me, protect our borders. We still, and listen, I was an Attorney General for 8 years. I worked along that border. And I can tell you there are ways that we can still protect our border and still bring compassion to helping others who are being persecuted in other countries. So thank you. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you. I'd like to also mention that the huge appetite for drugs in our country fuels the drug cartels in these Central American countries. And also the violence that they perpetrate in those countries are often guns that come from our country. So we cannot simply shut everybody out and see nothing, hear nothing, speak nothing. It's all part of our responsibility also. Next, I'd like to introduce Wendy Young, the president of Kids in Need of Defense, to the podium. Wendy and KIND are doing great work. I've just spoken with many of the lawyers who provide volunteer legal services, and the advocacy that they do for unaccompanied migrant children. If they weren't there, these children would be left with very little going for them. Wendy, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. And I would like to thank Senators Hirono, Merkley, and Cortez Masto for their incredible leadership on such a critical set of issues. Just yesterday, there was widespread reporting that children arriving alone or with families make up the vast majority of arrivals at our southern border now. These children are fleeing unimaginable violence and are in desperate need of protection. As the president of KIND, an organization dedicated to providing quality pro bono legal representation to unaccompanied children, I know firsthand how important it is for our immigration enforcement and justice systems to be modernized and equipped to properly address this vulnerable population. Right now, less than half of the unaccompanied children in deportation proceedings have an attorney by their side. And as the senator mentioned, this includes toddlers, 2-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds. I've seen a 5-year-old in court myself, clutching a doll, appearing before an immigration judge. And they're expected to be able to prove that they have a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Imagine asking a 5-year-old to do that. Just in the past few months, we have seen children die in Border Patrol custody. We've seen children with strong protection claims give up their cases because they could not find an attorney to help them fight their case. We see children continuing to be separated from their parents to this day. The bills being introduced today will ensure that children are treated properly while in federal custody, the senseless family separations will stop, and that children will have a fair opportunity to tell their story and ask for protection from the United States. All three bills together will go a very long way to make the system more efficient, creating a more seamless safety net for these vulnerable kids, and ensuring that we fulfill our obligation to protect children coming to us looking for help. The Fair Day in Court for Kids Act would provide legal representation for all unaccompanied immigrant children during their proceedings. Among other things, the bill would require the government to provide legal counsel to these kids, inform the children of their right to counsel, and ensure that children who are in detention in a government facility have access to legal representation. The Child Trafficking Victims Protection and Welfare Act would help ensure that children in CBP custody at the border receive proper care based on the expertise of child welfare and health professionals, also receive access to legal services, and remain in safe and sanitary conditions. The Immigration Court Reform Act would ensure that our immigration judges, the vast majority of whom want to do the right thing in their courtrooms, have the time to fully and fairly consider the cases before them to reach an objective decision in the best interests of the children. I will end and close by saying thank you again to the senators for their incredible vision and leadership on these issues. KIND stands in strong support of these bills. We hope that Congress will see that these are practical, pragmatic, solution-oriented pieces of legislation and move quickly to enact them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Finally, I'm pleased to introduce Kate Voigt, who heads up advocacy on immigration enforcement, due process, and removal defense for the American Immigration Lawyers Association. Thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you, Senator Hirono, Senator Cortez Masto, and Senator Merkley for your leadership on these crucially important issues. The U.S. immigration system suffers from long-standing and profound problems that have severely hampered the capacity of the courts to deliver justice and fair decisions in a timely manner, and that have also undermined the public's confidence in the immigration court system itself. The Immigration Court Improvement Act and the Fair Day in Court for Kids Act would provide vital safeguards for children and adults who are navigating this extremely complex system. AILA is grateful to each of you for advocating for positive, forward-thinking solutions to these issues. As a bar association of over 15,000 immigration attorneys nationwide, the American Immigration Lawyers Association's members are on the front lines of this long, troubled court system. Every day, AILA attorneys witness how people are hurt by policies that put a premium on the quantity of cases that are decided over the quality of the decisions themselves. Every day, they see vulnerable children who could not even begin to ask for protection from unthinkable persecution without counsel by their side. And every day, they zealously advocate for their clients in the face of a court system that is increasingly blind to due process and fairness. In fact, the U.S. immigration court system has a conflict of interest built into it. The courts are housed under the Department of Justice, which means that the Attorney General is responsible for overseeing not just the immigration judges who are deciding immigration cases, but also the DOJ attorneys who are prosecuting immigration cases at the federal court level. Under the Trump administration, the Department of Justice has exploited this inherent structural flaw to enact policies that are aimed at undermining judicial independence, minimizing the roles of judges, and rushing cases through the system. What is the cost of these policies? Thorough and careful review of each case. What is sacrificed by these policies? The guarantee of fairness and due process that are the underpinnings of the American legal system. What is the answer to these flaws? In addition to passing the Immigration Court Improvement Act, Congress should create a new immigration court system that is independent of the Department of Justice. Only by freeing the courts from the control of the Attorney General and the DOJ can we ensure their integrity and their independence. Integral to due process and the delivery of justice is legal counsel. Study after study has shown that asylum seekers, families, children, and individual adults are many, many times more likely to win asylum or other legal protections that they qualify for if they are represented by counsel. Our nation cannot risk returning asylum seekers back to their home countries, back to rape, torture, or persecution in their home countries. We need counsel and fair courts to secure that. Today, the American Immigration Lawyers Association proudly stands with Senator Hirono, Senator Cortez Masto, and Senator Merkley to balance the scales of justice. Now is the time for our nation to restore integrity to our immigration courts and fairness to our immigration legal system. AILA calls on senators from both sides of the aisle to join these efforts and uphold America's core value of guaranteeing a fair day in court.
Thank you very much. I think that if we were to ask anyone, what if your child, 2 years old, 4 years old, in a foreign country, facing deportation, were having to stand in front of a foreign court to speak for themselves. It's crazy. It's inhumane, and yet this is what we expect of some 11,000 unaccompanied minors right now in facilities in our country, all across the country. That's what's happening in our country. Thank you all for being here, and we can take some questions now. Okay, if you're totally convinced and astounded, we can all get on to advocating for these bills because the need is great. And one of the things that sometimes happens is when there's I would say, a lack of ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. It's very clear that these families, because the changing character of the migrants are now not, as Jeff said, not the single men from Mexico, but it's families now escaping extreme violence in their own countries. So yes, a system that was set up to deal with single men coming from Mexico is not capable of dealing with the children, but that means that we need to address the situation. But when I heard some people, some of my colleagues say that these parents are risking death and subjugation, sexual assault for these children as though it's the parents' fault, Where is the ability to put ourselves in the shoes of these families who are escaping violence? Do they even know what it must be like to be living in a country where you could die just by facing up to these horrible drug cartels? See, if we lack that, if we don't have that ability to empathize, these are the kind of policies that you end up with. That's why the battles continue. And those of you who are nodding your heads, thank you very much. I know that you are advocates out there. Mahalo.